Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome to Ask Me Anything for our Exodus class. It is Friday, April the 6th, and I do have a few questions to answer for you. I'm going to jump right into these. The first two questions come from John, and the question is, how many times did the livestock die in Exodus? I did a little reading on this and did not develop a very strong answer. They do seem to all keep dying even through the firstborn of the last plague. And actually we can add it, make it even a little worse. If you think about it, the animals keep dying all the way to the Red Sea, because quite a few horses would have drowned in the Red Sea. So yeah, what do we have going on in Exodus? If you go back to the plague accounts, we have several of the signs that God does that afflict the livestock and such of the Egyptians. The first one is the fifth plague, where it says that a deadly pestilence strikes. This is in chapter 9. The livestock in the field, horses, donkeys, camels, herds, and flocks. But God makes a distinction, so the animals of the Israelites are left alone. And then in the seventh plague, there's thunder and hail are sent against the Egyptians, and that's a warning. And anything that's left out in the open field, which means the livestock, it says explicitly in chapter 9, verse 18, that ends up being killed as well. Then we have the Passover, the final plague here as well. That includes all the firstborn of the livestock pass away. So you just keep having animals die. So this gets back to a question, what of historicity? Let me say a couple of things about this. Now, there's different ways that one can go about dealing with the text. One of the obvious ways is to say this is a contradiction, and so it calls into the truthfulness of the scriptures. Well, again, this does appear on the surface to be some kind of contradiction, but here's what we always have to understand, and this is how I answer. I mean, there actually are ingenious ways of harmonizing these things. You can look up on the internet, look at like answers in the Bible and such, and you may find some of those things persuasive ways of harmonizing. I think that one of the first things that you want to do, though, is you need a hermeneutic, because these are the kind of things that really bother people. It's the same in the Gospels, where how many angels were there at the tomb. How did Judas die? I mean, there's different accounts. I think it's critical to remember that we have to recognize that the original readers, the original audience, would have recognized these things as well, and they didn't presumably bother the persons, or I'm going to say the text probably would have been corrected in some way to make it to actually harmonize. So we have to recognize we're not the first persons to see these things. And I think in terms of the Exodus, what this is showing is, again, these are signs, these are power signs to deliver God's people from the hand of Egypt. And the question ends up being, is there room for hyperbole within the text? Because obviously if they're all dead, they just can't keep on dying. So I think the point is that God keeps acting out signs against the Egyptians, but I wouldn't want to try to stress the data too much. Again, you can push back on me a little bit if you'd want to in a question online, but that's how I would deal with that. Recognize that we as modern readers weren't the first persons to notice this, and then give room for the text to be hyperbolic at certain places. Again, there are ingenious ways that we can harmonize those, but I don't really think that's what you were getting at. Second question has to do with the blood of the covenant in the Passover. In the first Passover, the blood is smeared on the door, lintel, and post. In the liturgy, the blood does not seem to have a strong role in the development of remembrance for future generations. Then when Jesus celebrates the Last Supper, he does bring a focus on the blood he will shed and how it fits into communion. Am I missing something? No, not at all. I think you want to do a couple of things. Now, obviously, the main instructions for reenacting the Passover for subsequent generations to this original Exodus generation has to do with the meal. That's because there is only one Passover, so they're always looking back as a means of remembering. So they're not going to put the blood on the door because there's no threat against the nation at that point. And you can even imagine it. ultimately the Passover is going to be celebrated in Israel itself, and so there's no need to actually have this blood on the covenant to pass over Israel, because it's all of God's people that are essentially celebrating the Passover. You can also compare like the Deuteronomic instructions here. But here's the whole piece. When you would be celebrating Passover, you're hearing the Passover story. So don't assume because the liturgical pieces focus on the meal that there's not a reminder of how the original story was reenacted. Because remember, when you read Exodus 12:1 to 13:16, there's a mixture of the past and the liturgical celebrations in the present. And, the Passover has several different roles. And Passover has to do with proclamation. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at. Jesus talks about, his blood of a new covenant. When you look at, say, in 1 Corinthians, when Paul gives the order for communion, he includes that wonderful saying, 1 Corinthians 11:26, for every time you eat this bread and drink out of this cup, you're announcing and proclaiming the Lord's death until he comes. So the very act of celebrating Passover is a proclamation. So in ancient Israel, it was a proclamation that reaffirmed, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. That would have been a powerful witness in the ancient world when the Jewish community celebrates Passover, celebrates the time in which God did for God's people what they could not have done for themselves, liberated them from oppression. Now, obviously in the New Testament, this becomes highly significant, the whole issue of the blood, because now Jesus comes along. He's the Passover lamb. Jesus becomes the lamb. So the death of Jesus takes on the role of the death of the lamb. And again, there would have been blood because they're killing a lamb to eat the Passover meal. So there's the blood, right? And so now Jesus comes along, makes that explicit and highlights his blood after he's just eaten Passover. Because they're not going to the Costco and buying lamb chops. They're out slicing a lamb's throat, blood comes out, they're eating the animal, right? So there would have been, this animal would have been sacrificed. So now in the new covenant, obviously Jesus can then take that symbol and bring it upon himself. So I think you're right that in the New Testament, it takes on a renewed significance because now we have a new climactic form of Passover, which is Jesus's death on the cross for the sins of the world. What are the key elements for writing the synthetic statements? This is a module 7 questions. I have a couple of module 7 questions here. And what are the key elements? That is, you want to be as specific as possible, as interpretive as possible, as short as possible, 2 to 3 sentences. And you want to make sure you're theologically interpretive. So you don't want your statement for these module 7 papers to be just merely descriptive of the text. You want to bring out the interpretation of the text, not just the description of the explicit things that happen in the text. And that makes a good statement. Again, 2 to 3 sentences. You want to be as specific as possible. I ought to be able to see your angle. It ought to be clear that you've done the research on the passage and that your interpretive voice is clear through that statement. And then obviously the next sections flesh that out. And there's also a question here on what are you looking for in the second part, where it's what is said about the subject. Again, you have limited words, but what you want to cover are the key aspects of the interpretation. What are the questions that you have to answer as an interpreter to do this text justice? So what are the meanings of some key words? How's the passage structured? What are the interpretive challenges in this passage? I'm going to be specifically looking for that. Are you aware of the exegetical issues, the interpretive issues that an interpreter has to deal with to do this passage justice? So make sure you're aware of that. Also, this is Hebrew exegesis, so make sure you're aware of any nuances in the Hebrew text that you would need to bring out and show. Now, what you don't want to do in part 2 is do a bunch of parsing. You don't have to refer to the Hebrew at all in part 2 unless it's exegetically significant. So you need to make those decisions, and you bring out of the Hebrew those elements that are exegetically significant. And again, I'll be looking for that. In terms of resources to use, obviously use the Fredheim commentary. You can look up the text in the index of our dictionary of the Pentateuch. You can use the God made known text, or the God who makes himself known. And don't neglect Asbury Scholar. There's a video that shows how to use Asbury Scholar, but you can find scholarly resources to help you with that. Again, thanks for listening. Again, we'll do this next week again. If you have questions, send them in to me. I want to take this time to answer as many questions as I can. I look forward to serving you more. Have a great day. Live by faith, be known by love, and be voices of hope. I'm Brian Russell, and it's a privilege to serve as your teacher this semester.